All right, so folks, I'm going to talk to you about this talk I like to give about this program. And you know, the whole preface of our conversations in today's world, 2025 in Colorado, is really has this new shining star in the middle of it, and that is HB 241117, which was legislation that passed last year that engaged CPW in recognizing and studying rare plants and invertebrates, and recognizing invertebrates as wildlife, right? That's huge. And so when this happened, I really feel like I knew that people were going to ask us to help more. And we had only really engaged with the Forest Service project thus far as community scientists. And I put in a talk for this conference along those lines, and lots of action has happened since. So every year there's a few conferences around the state that kind of aggregate people in our industry. And this is Partners in the Outdoors Conference, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Another huge one is the Colorado Open Space Alliance Conference, which is usually in the fall. And then I don't know, can you think of any others, folks? I can't think of any others right now that are really aggregating the practitioners, and the people who work in for the cities, the counties, that provide the landscapes that we like to recreate in. All right. And now you can see my slides, right? But I can't see you. So just interrupt me if you have any questions. So when I give this talk, I've given it at COSA and at the Rocky Mountain Community Science Conference in Wyoming last fall. It's a long talk, right? The talk was short, but they gave me a long period of time in these manager oriented conferences. So we have an hour and 15 minutes. And I like to start by just engaging the audience, right? So this is the kinds of stuff that I ask them, like, do you manage natural resources? And what life zone do you manage? And do you use volunteers or citizen scientists? And if not, do you want to use them in the future? And then folks in the room like organize themselves by their life zones. And that's a fun breakout. And they go walk around the room and figure out how they're organized. And essentially, like once we do this, after I give my talk, we'll have workshop breakouts and we'll answer these questions. But ultimately, what we come to find is that we all have common needs, right? And CONIPS can CONIPS members can really serve those needs. And that is the theme of this talk, engaging your community in the work of ecological monitoring. So we hope to get to know each other, to understand our common challenges and needs, and also to figure out like what volunteer engaged solutions exist on the landscape. The Colorado Native Plant Society was founded in 1976, and I find it really interesting that here we are a half century later, and we're really in the same exact situation, right? We feel like this sense of angst about what's going on in the world and the protection of our natural resources. But our founders felt that same thing 50 years ago. And thinking about the history of our country, right, in the mid 20th century was at the time when our public lands were becoming established and our environmental legislation was being formed. So right now we're in a place where it's like 50 years later, what has come of those choices and management choices? And we are in the age of restoration. So what has come of it? Restoration. And we will get to talking about that in just a second. So just thinking about how CONIPS is organized, we are a statewide organization and we have committees that operate around the around the state. They convene monthly to plan projects like the ones we're going to talk about today. And we're going to specifically talk about the kinds of projects that are running through our field studies committee and our restoration committee, because that's what I think you folks would be interested in. And Ala and Tan, I'm so glad you're here, because these are the kinds of things you can do on your own time. And I will come and love to give you a field mentoring day to facilitate that start. So on a statewide level, we convene for thought leadership in different avenues that touch our mission. But on the ground, we organize ourselves into chapters with geographic orientation. Most of the people in the call today are in the northern chapter, that being everyone in Fort Collins. And then we also have Melly from the Metro Denver chapter, and Tom and I are in the Southeast chapter, but we also have Intermountain chapters and West Slope chapters. So all of this work began with legislation, and this is an important theme to keep in mind, right? Money talks, but money doesn't flow through our cultural environment and our political environment without a legislative push. And so some of these legislative pushes that I mentioned in the past, like for example, I wrote my dissertation about community science, which we call citizen science as well, before the issues of what it means to be a citizen had unfolded. But all of this started and was jumped from the piece of legislation that funded the National Science Foundation in the realm of community science. And it was called Public Participation in Scientific Research, PPSR. And you can see, if you look at like a map of publication data, that after 2009, like the amount of community science literature really skyrocketed. It was almost nothing before. And other countries and areas of the world have their own stories about community science, but ours is really pretty young, under 20 years old. So here we are thinking about the legislation that pushed our work to in the Rocky Mountain Native Plant Materials Program. It was the National Seed Strategy for Rehabilitation and Restoration. And you can access these documents, like and Tan, you might use these documents as primary literature when you do your presentation at the end of the semester. So the National Seed Strategy is really an effort to provide a coordinated approach for restoration. And there's a lot of language that really works to link the private sector to the public sector. So another thing that's kind of changed in my career is that, back in the day when I wanted to work for the Forest Service 20 years ago, like the Forest Service did everything itself. But now our public land managing agencies like use contractors from the private sector to achieve their work. So linking these entities is an important part of this process. And so, as we know, some of the stresses that give rise to this problem statement involve invasive species, wildfire, habitat modification, land overuse, and climate change. So the National Seed Strategy's goal is to put the right seed in the right place at the right time. And what we are doing by collecting seed is achieving the mission to ensure a genetically appropriate seed bank, a seed resource for use in future restoration applications. So there's all these little other dots on the map in building this conversation. And one of the biggest pieces for me is the use of native plants. Until about 2015, the word native plant was never engaged in a legislative context. The reason why we have smooth brome and cheatgrass on the landscape is because we put it there. Because when we were meeting the demands of the Homestead Act in the early 20th century, we had to improve the land. And what did we do? we made it rangeland. And how did we do that? We used old world seeds that we had used there back in the old world to build range. And now we're asking ourselves, what have we done, right? And how can we solve it? And so we see in all this language, right, the repetitive use of the word native plants. And oftentimes people just don't even really know what a native plant is. And at this point in the talk, I would do a little icebreaker, which I've never attempted to do on Zoom, but I ask people, like, what if you want to understand what a native plant is? I say, everybody in the room stand up. And then I say, if you were born in Colorado, stay standing up. If you were not born in Colorado, sit down. And 80 to 90% of the people in the room, no matter how old they are or how big the group is, sit down. And then the next question is, if your parents were born in Colorado, stay standing up. If they were not, sit down. Right? So we only have to go to grandparents to leave roughly one or two people standing in a group. Sometimes you might have to say great grandparents, but usually that gets down to so few people that I can ask those people to describe their origin stories. And almost always those people are indigenous, right? They have like Mexican roots that tie into a landscape before America was a country, where like Colorado and Texas and all the lands to the south were just part of Mexico, right? Um, and or folks have other indigenous roots. So those are the natives, right? I absolutely hate those bumper stickers where it's like the license plate and it says native, because I guarantee you 99.9% of the people who have those bumper stickers are not native. So sorry for the tangent, but that's how we get people understanding this language. Now, there are some goals of the National Seed Strategy, and you are actively participating in these goals. So thank you so much for your participation in the CoNPS Restoration Committee. So we identify what seeds are needed and we try to find them on the landscape, right? That's what we talk about endlessly in this committee. And we don't operate too much on goal 2, but we're getting there, and I'll describe that a bit later, right? We need to know more stuff about native plants. And every question you might have, every research question could be asked about every species. So that basically puts us in a place where there are literally millions of research questions that could be asked, right? And so we want to figure out what questions need to be asked and how we can solve them. So like we talk a great deal about like the seed transfer zone, right? So when you're working in INAT, you might not notice that there are other layers in our field maps and the interns are familiar, right? That really describe the ecoregion and a seed transfer zone. So where are there habitat analogies where we could collect the seed from one place and put it in another place, and that would make sense. Other pieces to this puzzle, like our polyploidy, right? We were just in a workshop last week and I had never thought about this before, but when we're trying to identify the genetically appropriate seed bank, right, we have to consider the biology of these plants. Like plants have the ability of polyploidy, which is not as common in other types of organisms, but essentially they just have different chromosome numbers and they could potentially swap sexual material, but it's not going to make a viable offspring. And so asking questions like that, I mean, that's pretty deep stuff connected to what we're working on in the ground, on the ground. So goal 3, again, you're a big piece to this puzzle, right? Curtis and Melly are part of the management team. And when you contribute your efforts in iNaturalist, you really help us to make timely and informed decisions about where the plants are and how we can collect the seeds with the least ecological footprint. And that footprint is driving. So the work you do to help us virtually scout really reduces our mileage, which is part of this whole climate puzzle, right? We want to keep the carbon in the ground, not in the atmosphere. And finally, I feel like CoNPS is really awesome at goal 4. What do? We connect people. We weave the fabric. We talk about this kind of stuff. And the land managers don't have time to talk about it, nor do they have an audience, right? So you are an important piece of building this fabric of communication. So tell people about the work you're doing here, right? So ultimately, the seed strategy looks like botanists collecting seeds, researchers helping us to figure out if we're collecting the appropriate seed. We need farmers to grow it, and we need nurseries and seed storage facilities to protect the resource over time. And finally, we need to put the right seed in the right place at the right time. So as mentioned, that part of the presentation, I did veer off a bit from the standard text, but I try to keep it pretty linear so that I'm not coloring it, but I did color it pretty well. If you want the primary voice, access these documents. All right, so our Rocky Mountain Native Plant Materials program, you guys are getting familiar with it. We are collecting seed to build that seed bank. We are doing lots of things to engage that process, right? We're going through phenology, watch in iNaturalist. We're aggregating our species of interest so we can explore their geography, so we can know where to go to collect them. And so all the things that a person could do, you've been learning about in this committee space. Now, I don't know if people know that we're doing the Native Plant Materials Program or if it was largely driven by the passage of HB 241117. But all of the sudden, people are realizing that we can do this, right? And so we're being asked to do it more. And I wanted to pivot at this point just to ask if you have any questions from the first part of the talk before I go into these other opportunities. All right, and nothing in the chat. I can't see the chat. Nope. All right. Okay, so in our field studies committee, we have been doing work that about rare plants, right? So that has expanded to the statewide natural heritage survey. So if anyone here has engaged with the field studies committee in the last couple of years, you might have participated in the Adopt a Rare Plant program. We are no longer running the Adopt a Rare Plant program because now we have even bigger needs and questions, and that is to work the statewide natural heritage survey. And so the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, this organization is housed at CSU, and they are our primary partner for both the Rocky Mountain Native Plant Materials Program and Adopt a Rare Plant. So they are asking us to please help us expand from just rare plants, help us collect information about plants, animals, insects, wetlands, etc., to build out our statewide natural heritage survey. There is a really great training that already occurred, and let's go there now. So I'm going to put this in the chat. If you follow this link, you'll find the training that occurred on March 27th, and you might have participated in that Zoom event. But if you didn't, you can watch it here on the page and get a sense for how you can engage with the statewide natural heritage survey. If you have been coming to the restoration committee meetings, you already have learned a lot about how to use iNaturalist. And iNaturalist is the data collection tool for the statewide natural heritage survey. All right, moving right along. For a couple of years now, we have been working with the Xerces Society to tell CoNPS members about the Bumblebee Atlas. And the Atlas is a community science project aimed at gathering data about bumblebees. Now, this one has like more protocols than just iNaturalist. Like you get the bees and then you chill them down so that they basically stop moving so you can take their pictures and you submit your data. It seems really interesting and fun, but only about bumblebees. Oops. So if you are interested in that, let's take a look here. I'll put this in the chat. You can visit the Bumblebee Atlas page. Uh, And you can see the results from the community science efforts in past years, which is really exciting. The other fun thing about this is it's not just Colorado based. So if you are traveling or if you're going to college somewhere else for grad school, you can engage in this kind of project in lots of different spaces in our country. Now, this CPW and asked me, I don't have any like follow-up information, but there is also a third ask that kind of relates to both of these. And just like this statewide natural heritage survey here, looking at all kinds of invertebrates, not just bumblebees, is something that CPW is going to start doing as well. So more on that later. Now, one thing that has come to pass in the last couple of months within the CoNPS environment is that our research proposal to Jefferson County Open Space was approved. And this is a plant growth study. And we look to answer questions that follow the work we're doing for the Rocky Mountain Native Plant Materials Program, right? Like, okay, so we've got the seeds. Now we got to try to grow those seeds up. And also, how are they going to do once they're planted out back in the restoration context? So that is what we're doing here. We are looking at 8 species, 4 forbs, and 4 grasses, and we're germinating them in the Colorado Springs City greenhouses. We are trying to do a germination frequency study, but it's hard because the Achillea millefolium and the Artemisia ludovicana like wasn't that clean, and the seed is very, very tiny. And so it was impossible to get to 1 species per cell. But what you're looking at here, just for basic methods conversation, we tried to restrict the number of seeds. These are the Symphyotrichum eriocoides, and you see how there's just 1 seed per cell. So Ala and Tan, especially, like if you were to set up a germination study, this is basically a fraction, right? You know how many cells there are, and there's 1 seed per cell. And so we're looking at presence, absence per cell and the date at which germination occurred. And with that information, you're able to figure out like what the percent germination was, right? We had 90% germination or 40% germination. And we're also able to aggregate across the 72 cells per species, what's the average time to germination, right? How many days did it take on average to germinate that seed? We are germinating the seeds in 2 types of soils. And this research has already been conducted once by Elizabeth Rose, who is now our CoNPS secretary, board secretary, and she's also a college student. And she looked at germination rates in the city greenhouse, and that research was presented at the last CoNPS annual conference in Durango. And then Kenner Houghton, who is now the Southwest chapter chair, she was also one of my students, and she did research about soil chemistry analysis. So we're essentially repeating both of their studies, just as like a preface to the plant growth study because we've got to do this stuff anyway. So why not measure it? So we're looking at chemical analysis in a proprietary soil mix that we make here in Colorado Springs, that is peat free, right? Because keep in mind that if you grow plants in peat, like ultimately from a climate resilience perspective, like that's a negative. You're never going to turn into a positive. Peat is a non-renewable resource that draws carbon from the ground and puts it into the atmosphere, and in no time frame will that peat be replaced. No human lifetime time frame. Furthermore, the harvesting of the peat moss is contributing, and aligned with things you might have heard about, like the melting of permafrost in northern latitudes, right? As it gets warmer and the permafrost melts, the peat's just decomposing without being harvested, and that's two bads, right? Two bad things that are happening, putting more carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, so sorry, I have all these little tangents. So we've been growing plants in Colorado Springs for several years now, in a proprietary mix that is mineral soil mixed with compost. The compost is made from horticultural waste, right? So from when they pull the annuals out and they do all that. So there is some peat in this compost, as there would be in any compost you make at home. And then the mineral base is called Crusher, Fine, Cimarron, Breeze, Squeegee. It's basically an analogy to our native soils. It is harvested somewhere from Colorado, depending on where your local rock yard is, it will be a native mineral component. And it basically is like gravel and sand and clay. And so we use a mixture of like 60% mineral, 40% compost for forbs. And that ratio gets flipped for grasses because thinking about it, grasses create more organic matter in the soil below them. They have annual senescence of all of their above ground parts. And then we are also growing them in the standard mix that every commercial nursery uses. And it all comes from this company called Lambert up in Canada. And we're using specifically Fertilome, but the base is, if a commercial nursery bought it, they would just buy it in huge quantities, same stuff. And then finally, we'll also analyze the field soils. Um, and what we found in Kenner's research was that this proprietary mix was very similar, chemically, to our native soils. And so we'll see what we find. That was in Colorado Springs, right? So we'll see, is it similar to soils in in Golden, in Jefferson County? All right, so then around 4th of July, the plants are going to be planted in SC10s. These are like deep tubes. And we will plant them out on Table Mountain in early July, in early September or August, and in early September. So there'll be 3 planting dates, and we'll need people to help with that. And in this study, typically for research, this kind of thing would be like everything stabilized, reduce error as much as possible. So like rows with black plastic, right? Maybe with fences around them to prevent herbivory. But Jeffco doesn't want to terminate these plants after the research. They want the research to be a restoration project. So we've devised a strategy. It's right along 93, right by the west trailhead of North Table Mountain and north, like up to Indiana. There's like this whole frontage of the highway, but below the mesa, that's where the study will be. And it is a smooth brome wasteland. And so they are going to use glyphosate to terminate the smooth brome. And then we will come in and we will plant, basically they're going to be little gardens of the different species all collected together, right? It's not going to be in rows, so that once the research is done, it just looks natural as much as possible. And it turns this smooth run wasteland into pollinator habitat because there will be native forbs and grasses there. So we'll be going to that west side of Table Mountain every other week from July to October to measure the plants. And we'll be looking at, I mean, I've proposed some standard plant growth measurements, but it's a lot of plants, like over 1,000. So, on the very simplest frame, a measurement of plant growth might be presence, absence, right? Has the plant persisted? Is it still there? And then beyond that, you might look at number of stems, number of leaves, number of inflorescences. You might look at total plant height, total plant width. So we'll be looking at that. And uh, since we're not going to terminate the plants, like we won't pull any up, but another piece of these methods might be like to look when they do, for example, like the plant select plant growth studies, um, they're in pots, right? So after the study, they wash all the soil off and then they dry out the plant material and you can measure like how much biomass was in the above ground parts versus the below ground parts. And so we won't be able to do that with our once the plants are planted out, but we do plan to do that with, at least three individuals of each species in each soil treatment before we plant them out. So like take them out of the SC10 tube, wash off the soil, dry it out, and see the root, the difference in roots, right? Anecdotally, when plants are grown in peat, like they might look robust above, but they don't have very strong root systems. And I've got some other pictures I'll show you on a different day that, like, when we pull plants out of the tubes, they have like huge root systems, even though they might be pretty small when we're using the proprietary soil mix. Whereas the plants in the peat might look really beautiful, but their roots are just a couple of inches long and not very rich in biomass. Okay. We will continue monitoring these plants to October. We just figured first frost somewhere in October. Then we'll do it one more time in the spring to see again presence absence, like what lived. And there might be some seed collection associated with this in the fall, so please stay tuned. All right, thanks for hanging in with me. I think those are all the things we've been asked to do that relate to what you've been learning about in this committee. And of course, we appreciate your participation and love your thought leadership, right? So if you're interested in engaging with us, you can engage with us in all levels of this. For example, we'll be publishing this research, right? Also, Tan and Ala, if you're interested, we'll make a poster. And so those kinds of opportunities are available. All right. Well, thank you for listening.
Hi, this is Tom. I just had a curious question about on Table Mountain. How did they come up with the research species list? Is there knowledge of what the ecosystem used to look like before the smooth brome moved in, or is this just kind of a best effort?
Well, Jeffco is a pretty like they do a lot of awesome stuff and they collected these seeds, right? And so that was one thing I let them decide. I was like, which species we use, that's up to you. And so, yes, I think they did have a pretty good idea of what they wanted to see in there and what should be there. And furthermore, it's locally collected seed. So it was seed that was already available in adjacent lands. And I'm going to put the species list in the chat right now. Oh, I guess that's changed a little bit.
I think the only thing that's been removed was the Giardia aristata. Everything else looks correct. Yeah, they collect a lot of seed for other restoration projects that they do within the county. And I'm not really sure if they selected those seeds because they knew that was what was present on Table Mountain prior to that. Um, More of a matter of this is the seed that we have available. This is the kind of restoration planting that we will be doing at our other properties. So let's test out and see how they do in these conditions and these growing conditions. So yeah, and it's no longer going to be right along 93. They've moved us up the trail a little bit because I think they're going to be converting some of that space to new expanded parking. But it will be basically at Table Mountain, Table Mesa.
So this is, I mean, we're just characterizing this best we can. So this whole thing is going to move north, because this apparently will become part of the parking lot. But we'll have these areas, like roughly circular areas that they've treated the smooth brome in, and then we will set up, uh we'll have in each circle, it'll be like plants with from different soils. Oh, I forgot to mention there's a fertilization treatment as well. And so there'll be like these different gardens that are in the circle, and they'll have all of the 8 species, and we will be measuring the plants. Now, we don't want it to be real visible, so we won't be marking the individual plants. We'll just know like that there's 8 of each species in this circle or whatever, and we'll collect the measurements and it'll all just get averaged out.
I also really like this project because of the volunteer engagement that we'll get from within the county, and all of those participants will get to see, the life growth stages of each plant and say, okay, now I can recognize this in my own home landscape and know whether to keep it or not. So yeah, just more education going around with the volunteers too.
And folks, there is a BioBlitz on Table Mountain on April 27th. And I'm going to put that in the chat. I am going to be there, because I figured that anyone who's going to come to a BioBlitz on Table Mountain might also be interested in assisting with this project.
That sounds like a super cool project. Just curious about how they're planning on treating the smooth brome, because it can be hard to get rid of.
They are spraying it with glyphosate, and they already did that, I think. And so, you know, just this is a kind of situation where, yeah, we don't necessarily want to use herbicides, but there are no existing natives. And if they encounter one, they're going to pull it out of the ground before they spray it. Um, but essentially creating that this is basically a big part to my own intellectual journey. Like people tell you you cannot revegetate in smooth brome, but let's see if we can.
Yeah, might as well give it a go.
And
But yeah, I
Jenny,
don't think there's any other options, like other than spraying, unfortunately, for smooth brome.
and I also recognize that like if Jefferson County Open Space is spraying smooth brome to build pollinator habitat, like I think they are way ahead, right? Because most people just say it's not possible. They're not even trying, right? And Jenny, I was wondering, like, you guys, are you this, do you engage this far down the cycle? Like, what happens to the plants in your greenhouse in Utah?
Um, I'm I'm not 100% sure. I'm less involved in all of that, but I think that um some of the live planting we do like in conjunction with herbicides based on where we're planting them because the shrubs need, some space to avoid competition. So I think they have had success with that or with kind of doing a mechanical removal around where they're gonna plant the shrubs. So we do some of that stuff like pre-planting our live plants. And then afterwards, it just kind of depends on the project. Like, I don't know if we've had a lot of continued monitoring of them, but we have done some things, I think, where we're trying to kind of monitor where each individual plant went and, like, keep an eye on the health and see if it's being successful or not. I think some of the stuff we're working on is with like using drones and stuff to do that too. So more monitoring and then, yeah, we might, apply herbicides depending, but it's also, yeah, catch 22 with that. So,
Yeah, but like CDOT also, like the next research study I'll probably tell you guys about will be with CDOT. And I've been talking with Pam about like this snow fence, living snow fences. Like this is a big thing that CDOT is interested in. And it involves shrubs, like you said, and using native shrubs like rabbit brush and yucca and stuff. And now if you're working with a shrub, then you can get a GPS that has unit that has enough accuracy to like drill down onto a single shrub, right? But in this setting, these plants are only going to be like 2 foot centers, right? So it'll be impossible to GPS the individual ones. But we will use iNaturalist, right? It just won't.
mhm.
All of them will look like they're just in one spot, right? On iNaturalist. But if you're working with shrubs, you can get to the like appropriate coordinates of it, find it. So, but yeah, we've been talking about that. Like, how do you monitor that? Like, it'll be lots of miles, you know?
Yeah.
um,
Cool. That's exciting.
yeah.
Yeah, I hope that works and inspires a lot of other people to want to change their smooth brome patches into native landscapes. Because if you just can change people's mind to stop looking over this giant smooth brome patches, then that opens up a ton more areas for restoration.
Yeah, exactly. And like people, I know Roundup's bad, right? But people don't fully understand the chemistry of it. Like it doesn't persist in the landscape very long, and as long as you're not near water, like it's not uh jeopardizing the water resource. So those are some things to keep in mind, right? All right. Melly.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, hello.
I was thinking we could show the species guide and just remind people about this effort.
Oh, sure. Do you want to share that from your screen or shall I from mine?
Yeah, I can share it from my screen. So we are working on a species guide for the Rocky Mountain Native Plant Materials Program so we can really be helping people to know what these plants look like. Oops, sorry. What happened? So if you're interested in assisting us, we're right now building this publication. And essentially, we are looking to scope out the plants. So once we get into the field, we have a real solid idea about what we're looking at because reliability in this kind of thing is, did you pick the right plant from which to collect the right seed for the right place at the right time. So we are in a stage right now with the species guide where like most of our pictures are in there, most of our maps are in there. Serena and Curtis. Serena is one of the other interns. They're working on the phonology piece of it. And we're picking up habitat information from FEIS, the Fire Effects Information System, which is a web-based tool. So if anyone would like us to be, or would like to help us scope the habitat piece for our target species, that'd be wonderful. And then there's also key features. And so we've been pulling this stuff from Acker Field, and that's another piece that we're still working on. It needs help. And so if you're interested, please let us know. And we did figure out that the common lookalikes was, I think this was our biggest question mark, but Curtis was like, oh, well, usually Acker Field just mentions what the like lookalikes are. So that's another piece we're working on that isn't quite finished. And so if you are interested, this will be a great resource. And you can see it'll be on a spiral bind. So I think the vision over time is that as the target species shift, we'll just take some pages out and put other pages in. And this will be a continued resource. And
And if
Melly, what
anyone's,
time is that training? Yeah, on Saturday.
I'm training 2 people tomorrow at 6 p.m. Virtually. So if anyone is interested in tagging along on that, or would like to reach out separately, I will put my email in. And we'll be deciding on actual seed collection